Tonight's talk, Agile Success Factors, 3 Keys to Drive Your Software Development Goals. Our speakers tonight are Dave Todaro and Diana Bourns. Dave and Diana would like to do a quick introduction.
Sure, we can go ahead and switch to our slide deck. And
Yeah.
we have some slides to go along with our introduction.
All right.
All right, so let me just start by saying thanks for having us. We've spoken for Agile New England in the past, and I do see some familiar faces. I think it's been a little bit, so we are glad to be back. And I thought that Mentimeter was really interesting. It looks like a lot of you are having some success. You're using Agile and having success with it. That's great, better than 50%. And perhaps maybe could use a little help with testing to make sure that you're producing consistently good results. So tonight's presentation, Agile Success Factors, 3 Keys to Drive Your Development Goals. You know, running Agile projects with Scrum framework is simple, right? It's 10 things, but it's not that easy. It's hard to do all of those things all of the time. So hopefully you'll pick up some interesting tidbits from tonight's presentation, even if you do feel like you're running Agile successfully. We at Ascendal are software developers, so a lot of tonight's presentation was created with software projects in mind. But as you all know, Agile can be applied to any number of projects. Any project with a prioritized to-do list, a team, and a need to coordinate daily work is great for using Agile. For example, at Ascendal, we use Agile and Scrum to run our marketing department. It has especially come in handy. Right now, we're in the process of completely redoing our website. We're building a test website. So we have a list of user stories for the new website, and we have broken down the features, and then we can prioritize them. So let me get into introducing ourselves. Dave and I are going to share the responsibility of the presentation tonight. I'll start off. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself and Dave. So I'm Diana. I'm the president of Ascendal. I didn't start out as the president of Ascendal. On my way to becoming president, I actually spent time in a lot of different roles. I started out as a product owner and then learned to be a Scrum Master, and then also had the role of Agile coach and trainer. And I had actually never heard of Agile before I started at Ascendal, but I drank all the Kool-Aid that Dave fed me, and now I'm a very big believer. I love to share my knowledge with others. You know, to teach is to learn. So I've spoken at many events on the subject of Agile and Scrum. Dave Todaro is the founder and CEO of Ascendal. We like to say that Dave eats, sleeps, and breathes software. He thrives on using his more than 35 years of software development and Agile experience to help our clients achieve results that drive growth and profitability. And he's an accomplished speaker and trainer, having presented to thousands of Agile users all over the world. I'll just take a moment to do a little shameless self-promotion about Ascendal. For those of you who don't know us, we are a leader in custom software development. We partner with companies as their full service development team to drive their business goals. We provide web, app, and platform development, product strategy and design, and we also do Agile training and coaching. Here are just a few of our clients. As you can see, we work with a wide variety of companies, from early stage startups to some of the largest companies in the world. and we're recognized experts in our field. We, as I said, love to share our many years of experience by teaching others, and we present regularly with a variety of organizations at many different types of events. And we wrote the book. Well, Dave wrote the book. Dave took 2 years to write down everything we collectively know about Agile and Scrum in this little 500-page book, which he published last year. And if you stay through the end of the presentation, you'll learn how you can be one of the lucky few to receive a complimentary copy of the book signed by Dave. But you have to stay till the end. Okay, so just a few things. I mean, we're accustomed to presenting in person. We typically love to have feedback from the audience. It's a little harder in this format, which I'm sure all of you are used to by now. So I think Jerry's going to keep an eye on the chat. If you get to something that we say, or if we get to a slide that you really don't understand, or if you want to comment on it, please go ahead. And, you know, when I'm talking, Dave might keep an eye on the chat and vice versa. So we are happy to stop and, you know, talk about things a little bit more. It always makes for a better presentation if it can be interactive. So that being said, here's a little word art for you. You've probably heard of a lot of these terms during your Agile journey. You know, Scrum, iteration, Kanban, stand-up, backlog. But all these words, this isn't really what Agile is. It's really not all of this stuff. What Agile is people. So, you know, we can have the best process in the world, but if you're not incorporating people and communication, then you're not getting the best results that you think. One of the things that I love about Agile is that it is about people. It's about people, helping people do better and producing better results. I don't know how many of you have heard about or read the book Peopleware. It's from 1987, so yes, it's a little dated. In 1987, I thought spiral perms were a really cool thing, and my hair looked like this. So that was quite a long time ago, but it's a great book, and its principles really still apply. So it really kind of preceded Agile, but Tom DeMarco summarized it nicely by saying, the business we're in is more sociological than technological, more dependent on workers' abilities to communicate with each other than their abilities to communicate with machines. So technology problems are not about technology. Technology problems are about people. If you are working on or with a team to deliver a result, again, this book will open your eyes. It's a great book. What we've discovered, you know, with the process, if you're using the Scrum framework and running an Agile project, if your process doesn't help to empower people and enhance the communication, it's going to fail. We were called in to work with a client a few years ago who had been working on completely rewriting their legacy application. The product folks started with a specifications document. It was 300 pages, took about 6 months to complete. They tossed it over the fence, and the developers started writing code. They tossed it over the fence to testing. They tossed it over the fence and said, okay, let's go to production. And when the product team circled back to review it, it had close to 1,000 defects. I'm not even exaggerating. 1,000 defects is what they said. And when I asked what happened, the product team said, well, they didn't build what I wanted. So at the core of this process breakdown was the lack of communication and the lack of personal interaction. You can't hand off a set of specifications, never talk to the team for months on end, and expect to have a quality product come out the other side. It's not going to work. And then think about the time lost. It was several years. So what has happened in that amount of time? Specifications have changed. The marketplace has changed. Are the priority for the American workforce, is that the same now as it was 6 months ago? No, I don't think so. So let's take a step back for a moment. Think, there's no Agile, there's no Scrum, no backlogs, sprints, or retrospectives. And if I asked you to just sit back and dream about what would you want in your team, whatever the project is that you're working on, what would you want in your team? It can be our dream team. So you would give them general direction and vision. They would work together and figure out how to build what you want. They'd show you their progress often to make sure that they were on track. They could even tell you when it was going to be done, which is really important in business and any project for that matter. You would be extremely confident in them. And you would largely just leave them alone to keep getting stuff done, right? And you would protect them and make sure other people left them alone as well. And they would knock your socks off day after day. It would be like magic. Do we have any Sleepless in Seattle fans out there? It would be like magic. This may sound like a dream, but when the right Agile principles are applied, this is exactly what you get. When you practice Agile right, it is like magic. So what else is Agile? Agile at its very heart is a social engineering framework. It gets a team of disparate individuals to do the right things at the right time to produce a consistent result. Again, it's magic. But Agile is just a little bit of help to get us to do what the most highly performing teams do naturally. I'll never forget one of our engagements. We went in and we were completely transforming a team to be Agile, and we had one software engineer who was extremely skeptical. And then after we worked with them for a few weeks, he kind of said, you know, I love this. This is the way that I want to work. This makes sense to me. So we just helped them to get to be a more highly performing team, which was all in all pretty natural. But most teams just can't magically do that. But you know, most teams can do it with the right help. So we want Agile and Scrum to be lightweight, to leave plenty of room for innovation. In fact, that's one of the key underlying factors of Agile and Scrum: be lightweight and leave plenty of room for innovation. So let's get into our 3 critical success factors. You know, there are all kinds of things that are important to be successful with Agile and Scrum, but we're going to hone in on what we think are the 3 most critical. So the first is discipline. Discipline sounds fairly easy, but it's really not. How many people have said, I am definitely going to the gym tomorrow at 6 a.m. and then didn't make it? Has it ever happened to you? Discipline is doing what you should do even when you don't want to. But we are humans. Discipline is hard, but it's absolutely necessary to be successful with Agile. You know, every Scrum team embedded in the team, we like to say that there's a mom. And some of you may know which role I'm referring to, but I'm referring to the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is the mom, male or female, doesn't matter. They get you to do what you should do, even if you don't want to. You need to clean your room. You need to empty the dishwasher. You need to do your laundry. I am a mom of 3 children, and not surprisingly, I really relished the role of Scrum Master, and I found that I was really good at it. So Scrum Master makes sure the process is followed. And continuously improving. So, you know, again, one part of, if you're running Scrum, is to have a retrospective. Never think, we're good. We're doing things fine. We don't need to improve on anything. We don't need to try new things. We at Ascendal, you know, we never miss our retrospective. Everyone on the team is at the retrospective, and you aim to continuously improve. And avoid Scrum butt. Does anyone know what Scrum butt is? Well, we're doing Scrum, but we're not doing the daily stand-up every day. Or we're running Scrum, but we skipped the retrospective the last 3 sprints. We're running Scrum, but we don't have any stakeholders at our sprint reviews. So you want to avoid Scrum butt. So the next success factor, and we will dive into these a little more deeply, empowerment. So empowerment is to grant power to your team. If you went to your manager and said, you need to grant more power to your team members, she might balk and say, well, what do you mean? I need to tell them what to do. But to empower means to trust, and the manager needs to support the team, but not tell them what to do. So, you know, executive support, it's extremely important when you're trying to implement Agile, especially in a larger organization. There will be bumps in the road. Whenever you are implementing change, there will be bumps in the road, and there will be naysayers. It's hard to keep going if the executives at the top don't support it. They need to say, no, I realize that we're going to have some bumps in the road, but we are sticking with it. We're going to stick with Agile. Servant leadership. Again, managers really should be a servant to their team, a servant to their direct reports, asking the teams what they need, removing impediments for them, and asking the boots on the ground, the team, for ideas on how to improve. And then technical inspiration. We find that you know, sometimes the CTOs have the hardest time letting go of the reins. Technical specialists are often accustomed to dictating every little technical decision, and they need to turn more into what we like to call inspirational leaders, rather than telling the teams how to do it, which can be a really difficult transition. And then the third is automation. Again, this is pretty specific to software development projects. It's making sure that the tools and the engineering methods are implemented to support Agile. Automated testing, so you know that the entire product is still working after a change is made, without having to test everything every time you implement a new feature. Continuous integration essentially means bringing our code together often to know it all works. Joey's working on this piece of code, Susie's working over here. You need to bring it together. And then automated deployment, pushing a button so that you can deploy your code and make it easy to do all of the development and testing within one sprint. So I'm going to talk a little more about discipline, and then I'll be handing it off to Dave to talk about the other two. So, at Ascendo, we didn't start out doing Agile training and coaching. We do development, but discipline is one of our competitive advantages. And we kind of fell into Agile and training because one of our development clients asked us for help. We would be at sprint review and they would say, wait, how did you do that in Jira? And how do you guys complete all your stories in the sprint every time? We have stories that leak from sprint to sprint to sprint. And could you just help me split these user stories? I cannot figure out how to split this story, but I know it's too big. So we kind of fell into it and then have really enjoyed it. But we found that, other companies would say, well, we had a trainer come in for 2 days. The training was great, but then the trainers went away and everyone expected the team to just do it. So as we know, when you can apply what you've learned, you actually retain it and learn it much better. So just attending a day or two of training, it's a great way to lay the foundation for Agile and Scrum, but until you practice it and have someone walking you through it and helping you with it, you really can't practice it until you really can't learn it through and through until you practice it. So it's a challenge to do it all day, every day. And I think kind of what separates the professional from the amateur is discipline, right? Dave and I were talking about this the other day. Dave, we play golf together, and as an amateur golfer, you may look at a professional golfer and think, my swing is pretty close to theirs. I should be able to shoot much better than the 98 that I most often shoot. Why can't I? Well, what you don't see behind the scenes is that professional golfer is practicing 6 hours a day, every day. I actually, a few years back, volunteered at an amateur golf tournament. These were amateurs, but it was national level. It was the junior amateur. It was national level amateurs. And one of the top golfers said that he had not had a day off from golf in 10 months. He practiced every day. So again, discipline. So this is, I really like this visual. It's a pretty simplified view of the Scrum framework. And I say simple, it looks simple, right? We have some artifacts, we have some ceremonies, but what happens if you don't do a few of these things? What happens if you don't hold a sprint review? If you don't hold a sprint review, or if you hold one without your stakeholders, then you're not getting the feedback from your stakeholders. You don't know if you're building the right product, and you can't pivot according to their needs if their needs change. It's Agile, right? In Agile, we welcome change because we know how to deal with it. Stakeholders won't know if you completed everything. And then there's also that human engineering side. You have the pressure of sprint review coming up, where you have to stand in front of your stakeholders and say, this is what we completed or didn't complete. And without that pressure, you're a little less inclined to get it done. And of course, we want to avoid Scrum, but, right? Again, you need to do all of the 10 things in Scrum and keep doing them. We see quite often the things that start to slip are following through on retrospective suggestions and ideas. You really should circle back to them. starting and ending meetings on time. If you're 4 minutes late to an 8-minute daily scrum, you've missed half of it. Saying a user story is done and demonstrating it at sprint review, even if it didn't actually meet the definition of done. And that's a very slippery slope. After you present at the end of a sprint for a software development project, you need to be able to confidently say, yes, these features that we just implemented are shippable. If the stakeholders say, hey, it looks great, let's ship next week, you can't say, well, actually, we didn't finish the unit test, or it didn't actually go through the integration test, or we still have to have security take a look at it. So again, being very disciplined is how you're going to see success. And then also be disciplined with not only your Scrum framework and your Scrum ceremonies and artifacts, but also with your Agile principles. Maintaining the backlog of your prioritized work, well, we don't want you to overinvest in the stories until they're getting close to the top of the backlog. You still can't slip and not be working on the product backlog all the time. You want to have an opportunity to talk about priorities with your team before you head into sprint planning so that they know what's coming up. It also helps to bring to light any user stories that might not be clear at all or that need to be better fleshed out with stakeholders prior to entering into the next sprint. And then being vigilant with splitting your user stories in a thin vertical slice and not being tempted to do, fall back into any waterfall ways by working on the architecture first and then working on your database and then saving the UI. I hear somebody with a small child that needs to mute. Okay. So yeah, being vigilant about splitting user stories, splitting features into a small vertical slice so that you are actually able to drive it to done within the confines of the sprint. Larger stories, you can easily, and I've seen it happen so many times, the product owner or even the developers think, we can't split that story, let's just take the whole thing in, we can get it done. They take one large story into the sprint, and guess what? It doesn't get done. So now you have nothing to show at sprint review. And not only that, your velocity drags. And then, on the flip side, if you have smaller, thin vertical slices of your stories, you get an increase in velocity. You get that feeling of completion. Again, that human engineering part. You get to complete the story, and how does it feel to complete 4 stories versus not completing any at all and having it take several weeks. So I did see a quick chat. What is meant by a vertical slice? We actually have a whole presentation on splitting epics and user stories, but let me give a good example. I have a great example, actually. Yeah, someone else is writing back. I have a good example that is not a software development project. So when the pandemic hit and our 3 college kids came home from their various locations around the country, my husband and I thought, oh, this is great. They probably won't have a summer job, so we're going to paint the house, save ourselves the $25,000 that it would take to paint our house. And guess what? The kids were busy with their classes, and then they did get jobs. So my husband and I were stuck painting the house this summer. And so I said, well, we're going to do one section at a time, and we're going to do everything needed for that small section. In fact, we kind of carved it out for the weekend. So our sprint was the weekend. And we picked, the highest priority was the where people drive up and come into our house, where our visitors see our house. So we did all of the prep work, all of the sanding, all of the priming, all of the trim, and all of the body for that one section of house. And a lot of people would fall into, oh, let's scrape the house. And they go around the house and they scrape all four sides of the house. Now let's just paint the trim, and they go around and they might get around to the trim, and then maybe they get around to the body. So a vertical slice would be taking a small piece of your big project and then driving that small piece to done. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here for a second, Di. There's a couple of reasons why that's really important. One is because you can, in fact, make some progress. Di's house example is great. If they had gone around and scraped the whole thing, they would have a scraped house probably for the entire summer and probably into the winter and next spring as things happen. Why? Because we don't really know exactly how long it's going to take. We've got a fixed amount of resources usually. We've got a fixed production cycle, a sprint, in her case, just the weekend. And so what happens is that because I don't actually know how long it's going to take until I get something done, it's really difficult to predict the schedule. And then the other thing is it reduces flexibility. So she now has two things. One, she has sections of the house done. And two, she has a lot of information about how long it's going to take. In fact, she could probably use some metrics around the sections that were done. For example, how large is it? How many windows are there? How many linear feet of trim, et cetera. And then compare that relative size to the other sections of the house and start to understand, well, how long will it in fact take us? Can we do that next section of the house in a weekend, or do we need to do a vertical slice? And this is a great example because it would literally be a vertical slice of the house as opposed to the horizontal slices. Right. We're not going around the house, around and around. We're going to do one slice at a time. And so by doing this process and switching it over to software, it gives us that huge advantage because we actually know what it's going to take to get something done, to get something to that point where it is potentially shippable, where I can have people walk in and see my beautiful house. And by applying that knowledge, I have the flexibility to take advantage of what I've built so far, because Di might say, you know what, the back's going to wait till next year. And so she actually shortened the schedule. She shipped early because she decided that she's going to de-scope some of the work of the house. And again, you know how long it's going to take. That last mile can be very deceptive. You can get 95% of the way complete, and you might actually be halfway done as far as calendar time goes. So that's what's so important about vertical as opposed to horizontal slicing. So super helpful, and that's a great example, Di.
Great. There's just one other question. I know the difference between product backlog and sprint backlog. Can you briefly explain what you mean by selected product backlog in your image and how it differs from sprint backlog? Sure. So the product backlog is your entire list of the work that needs to get done for your project. So for a software development project, you may have, version 1 stories. These are all the features I want in version 1. These are all the features I want in version 2. And if you're running a 2-week sprint, you'll do your sprint planning. You always have your highest priority features at the top of your product backlog. And then during sprint planning, you bring the features that you're going to work on during that sprint into your sprint backlog. And that's what you focus on for those 2 weeks and ignore everything else so that you're focused on that work. You know, the trick is to not add any scope to that work. Let the team just, you press the go button and they do the work in the sprint backlog. So yes, we probably won't ship the entire house this summer, but that's okay because the way we've done it, we're really happy with our results so far. And the next priority is the wall that looks the worst in the back, and the one that looks pretty good, we're going to leave until next summer.
I love how you applied Agile to your house painting project, and it's really
Yeah, my husband rolled his eyes when I said, honey, we're going to do this in an agile way. He's like, oh, geez.
Now, did you do backlog refinement with him, or?
No. I was the product owner in this case and the Scrum Master, I think.
So there was one more question here up above a little bit. Is there an architecture backlog or a function backlog between vision and user stories? So I think what you're alluding to here, David, is at the very beginning of a project, you have a blank piece of paper, you've got a blank screen and no code. How do you actually get going? And one of the things I talk about in my book is this concept of a walking skeleton. So ideally what you want to do is build the smallest possible amount of framework that's necessary to allow you to get going. Now for us, we try to constrain that pretty tightly. We try to constrain that to one sprint. And in fact, we don't even call it a sprint, we just call it prep work, because we don't want to use the term sprint, because sprint usually implies we're going to deliver some business value, something that an end user could actually get their hands on. So what we do during that prep work time frame of 2 weeks is we will take, in our case, we have a standard architecture that we use. We will stamp out a copy of that standard architecture. We'll spin up our continuous integration, which is going to take the code, automatically build it, automatically run the unit tests that are in that architecture in our template. And then we're going to create some test environments and some demonstration environments, and then get continuous deployment set up so that we can take the code, get it into those environments and get it usable. And we're also setting up things like Jira and our product backlog, our project management systems for this project. For us, we're doing this over and over and over again, you know, being in professional services. If you're in a commercial software development environment, you might just need to do this right at the beginning, and then you kind of work on that project for a few years. So that is what we want to do. What we don't want to do is we don't want to take 3 months and build out the entire data structure that's going to support the product for the next 14 months. And then we don't want to build out the entire data access layer. We don't want to build out the entire logging infrastructure and error handling infrastructure. We do have a few of those pieces that are in our template, but we just drop that template in and it all magically works because we've spent months and months and months building those reusable components. That's much different than if we took that time to build that out. So we want to be careful not to sort of get sucked back into that waterfall world of doing a big design up front and then doing a big architecture implementation up front. So I would say that time box it to 2 weeks, focus on the most important things. If you don't quite get everything done, then start building the product and flesh out those other few pieces during the first sprint. You should be able to if you have the right level of technical discipline, and I'll start getting into that in the subsequent slides and empowerment. You should be able to get that done in a month. If you can't get that done in a month, meaning the foundational architecture, building out the first few pieces of functionality, getting continuous integration working, getting continuous deployment working, there's probably something wrong. And it's either that your team doesn't possess the right level of technical prowess to be able to spin those things up simply because they don't know how, or there might be a disempowerment problem where they haven't been empowered to spin the things up that they want or that they need. Perfect example, one of our clients that we were helping coach them with their Agile process, we said, you know, your team's going to need some test environments. They need to be able to test their own code as they're building it. We can't just wait until every 6 weeks deploying it out to the shared development environment. We're going to screw everybody else up, and that's way too long. And they kind of looked at each other and said, well, on average, it takes us 8 months to get a new environment. And kind of smiled and said, okay, well, why is that? And they said, well, a few years ago, our IT got outsourced to a huge company, and we put in a ticket in, and it takes 8 months to get a new environment. So needless to say, we needed to get a little creative with them. And luckily, the management was empowering that team, and they used a combination of some cloud resources, and they actually took some servers that they had kicking around and literally set them up under some conference room tables and spun them up, and those were their test environments. But that's the sort of thing you can run into, particularly in a larger company. And that's why that empowerment is so important.
All right. Well, it's time for me to hand the microphone over to Dave anyway. So it was a good segue into our
Sounds
next
good. So I keep looking
slide.
over here just to keep an eye on the chat window. So I'll dive into this next section, talking about empowerment. And from that example that you just heard, luckily there was a lot of empowerment. We've seen the opposite, which is a little bit of an empowerment failure, where we've gone into companies and we've really tried to help the teams out. And they said, what's going to happen when you guys leave? And we said, well, what do you mean? What's going to happen when we leave? You guys are just going to keep doing this. They said, I don't think they're going to let us keep doing this. And so we talked to them a little bit more, and they had this big fear that the only reason they were allowed to do the things that they needed to do was because we were there. We were sort of there and seeing everything, and management was behaving. And so that led to some conversations with management and just making sure that they understood, look, when we leave, you need to keep this same level of empowerment with your team, or else you've just thrown all your money away. And that was really hard. It was really difficult to do because they wanted to hold on very tight. And in sort of traditional manager style, I want to manage what's going on. I want to direct the work. I want to tell people what's happening. That's the way that I feel good. Now, that luckily is not something that's widespread for every manager, but it is something that a lot of managers have to, I wouldn't say unlearn, but they need to shift their thinking. They need to shift their thinking a little bit. And let me show you why this is so important. So early on, it might be that the visionaries who came up with this bright idea have all the information. They might have the total vision. This is how the functionality is going to work. This is how the architecture is going to come together. This is how the code is going to be coming together. This is how the database should look. But then what happens is that the development team starts to engage. And now they start to get their fingers into what's happening. And now we need to allow that team to start taking over. Why? Well, you can see right here, they have the most information, right? The visionaries who have now been out of it and out of the details for a while, they don't have the right information anymore. It's the team that has the information. So this is why empowerment is so critically important. If I try to, as a visionary, hold on too tightly, I'm going to do a huge disservice to my team, because I'm going to come in and I'll be the hit and run manager, right? I'll come in and go to the, kind of listen to the team, and they say, well, we're having this problem, and, we're working on it. And then I bust out the marker and I go to the whiteboard. Well, maybe these days a virtual whiteboard. I go to the whiteboard and I start designing, the database structure that should come into play. And of course the team is, kind of politely, nodding and smiling, and that's all great. And they're thinking, this guy doesn't really know what's going on, because we've actually spent the last 3 months diverging from the original vision. Why? Because what's that saying? No plan survives contact with the enemy, right? We had this vision, and then we started to implement it, and then all of a sudden things changed. Well, we thought we were going to be able to do this, but instead we can't. We need to do this instead. So it kind of diverges. So question, what virtual whiteboard do we use? That's a really good question. We actually tend to not use a virtual whiteboard per se in terms of drawing and things like that. What we'll typically do is we'll typically use a knowledge tool such as Confluence in our wiki. And when we're collaborating, we'll typically take notes. We sometimes use a mind mapping tool. And then what we'll often do is we'll use the annotation features right inside Zoom, where you can draw on the screen and say, well, what about this over here? So it tends to be that our discussions oftentimes are a little bit more text-based. And then if we are looking at something visual, we're typically talking through it and then using those annotations. So in our particular world, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Di, if there's any tools that I'm not aware of that we're using, not as much the free form text that's happening. Oftentimes someone will jump into the chat window and put something in there, or put a link, what about this? So that that live collaboration works out pretty well. All right. Do the visionaries eventually serve the role as a customer to the development team? Absolutely. Yeah. So when I say visionaries here, this is oftentimes stakeholders, right? Many times it's a combination of a product visionary. Someone on the product team, could be the chief product officer, someone on his or her team that's sort of leading the initial research and figuring out what it is that we want to build for customers. And oftentimes there's also a technical stakeholder, whether it's the CTO or an architect at the company that's not embedded in the team, and they've been thinking about the big picture as far as technology goes. And that's really important. These aren't people that we kind of say, pat them on the shoulder and say, okay, now go over here. We got this. We're definitely working hand in hand. But there's a dramatic difference between working hand in hand and continuing to get input and help from those folks, and them trying to do the work or trying to direct the work or manage the work. So one of the companies I went into and spoke with, they don't use the word manager. And I really, really like that. What they use instead is leader. So they just remove the word manage altogether from their organization. And I think that's super critical, because the worst possible thing a manager can do is manage. Because unless they're embedded right in with the team, with their boots on the ground, as Di said, they're not equipped to manage, right? They're not equipped to direct the work. What they should do instead is support, empower, to grant power. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. All right, so moving along here, I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept, what I call inversion of power. So this is what the power structure looks like in most organizations, most traditional organizations. So the CEO has the most power, followed by the C-suite, vice presidents, etc., all the way down to the itty-bitty Scrum team at the bottom. And this is what we really don't want to see, right? Well, why is that? Because who's the least qualified to understand what we should do today to drive our goals forward? It's the CEO. The CEO has very little visibility in terms of the nuts and bolts of what's going on. Now, the CEO has to be the overarching visionary and understanding what's happening, and really the ultimate stakeholder. But that's dramatically different than the CEO marching down into the development area, or the virtual development area today, and saying, you guys should do it like this, you guys should do it like that, and trying to control what's going on. So I like to look at it more like this, right? In healthy organizations, the individual contributors, the Scrum teams or the Agile teams or the Kanban teams, whatever teams you have, but the individual contributors, those who are closest to doing the work and closest to delivering results for our customers, they should have the most power. If they say, hey, we had a retrospective and we identified some problems, we identified some impediments to us driving the business goals of this company, that's when the CEO, in a worst case example, that's where the CEO should get involved if necessary and say, we're going to make a change. Probably it's going to be the managers and the senior leadership happening that are changing that. But sometimes a pretty big change needs to happen in the organization. Sometimes there are systemic issues within the organization that do in fact need to be escalated that far. And so when the Scrum team has a problem that can't get resolved, then it becomes much more important for everyone above them to the greatest extent possible, drop everything and fix it. Going back to the example with our client and their test environments that took 8 months, that should have been a crisis. And in fact, we got a great response from the managers and senior leadership. We helped them, we helped the team communicate that problem. We helped the team communicate to the managers and senior leadership, why is this an impediment? Why is this going to get in the way of doing what you guys want us to do and what we collectively need to do to drive this company forward? They got very aggressive about it and said, you know what, forget about that whole 8-month thing. Don't even bother submitting a ticket. And we'll figure it out. We'll work together. And they did. And they had it resolved within a couple of days, which was great. So this, everything above the team, and you guys have probably heard this term before, servant leadership. Everyone in the company who is not producing those results should be acting in service of those who are producing those results. And that's super important. One other point I wanted to make, which is not directly related to this inversion of power, is going back to that idea of the early visionaries and stakeholders. If they want to get their fingers in there too much and direct the work of the team, the problem is that what happens when something goes wrong, right? And it's not really about finger pointing, it's about ownership. A lot of folks ask me, you know, I see your team and they totally own it. They totally own what they're doing for us. They tell us, you know, when things kind of didn't go quite right and what they did about it, they're fixing it. How do you do that? How do you get people to have ownership? And these are the same folks who are going in and trying to tell the team how to do it. And I explained to them, look, if you tell the team how to do it and something goes wrong, who owns that? And they kind of think a little bit. And I point at them and I say, you do. You own that problem. Because they want to say, well, the team owns that problem. They got to fix it. Well, if I'm the one that went in and told them how to do it like that, and it doesn't work out, well, that's my problem that I just owned. And that's the last thing that any leader wants to do, is own anything to do with the team. They want the team to have ownership. So what I tell folks is, look, if you want your teams to have more ownership, stop taking any ownership yourself. Grant them power, empower that team, and support them. It doesn't mean that you go, you know, to Tahiti for 2 months and then come back and see how they did. But your role needs to shift. You need to be an instructor, a teacher, a mentor, sometimes a therapist, and you just need to support them and help them out. Now you might say, look, you know, I see where you guys are going here. I just wanted to give you a heads up. We tried that path before on this other product. The team ran into trouble. You might want to talk about, you know, what that team ran into, and I'll talk about that in a second. Just wanted to see if there's any questions here. Okay, great. So how do I do this? How do I strike this balance between being a good leader and not taking on ownership, which is, again, the last thing I want to do. I don't want to get that phone call at 2 a.m. when something's broken and say, hey, Dave, this was your idea. Can you help us out? Can you jump on the Zoom call with this customer and help us, you know, figure out this issue, because this was your great idea? And I'm thinking, oh crap, I really got myself into trouble then. So what we find is that it's just a little bit about terminology. Instead of coming along and saying, you know, I want you to do it this way, there's some alternatives you can use. And this might sound a little, you know, kind of hand wavy, but it really works because it's sending a very specific message, which I'll talk about at the end. You might want to consider, you might want to think about, we've solved that problem before, and you can go look here in our wiki, or you can talk to this team. We've established a pattern. Look, we've run into this problem. If you guys solve it on your own, it might take you 6 to 8 weeks. I'm just going to hand this over to you, and you guys can do with it what you wish. And you know, expect them to look at that. Sometimes they'll look at it and they won't adopt it. And you might think, well, shoot, I kind of gave you guys the answer here. Why didn't you use my advice? And they said, well, you know, we analyzed it. We actually spent, you know, 4 of us sat down for a half a day and we analyzed it. It actually won't work for this particular problem. And here's why. Great, right? So I kind of nudged them in the right direction. I didn't tell them you must use this, but I provided it for them. This is the sort of support that leaders can provide to teams. Oftentimes, traditional managers go way too far in the other direction. Again, not to the extent of going to Tahiti, but they kind of hear about all this agile stuff, and then they say, great, they'll figure it out. And they kind of sit around and they kind of try to give the team enough rope to hang themselves, which is really a terrible situation to be in, but they've never been taught. They've never been taught that you're still valuable. In fact, you're extremely valuable. You've been here for 10 years. You know where all the bodies are buried. You've seen all these problems before. So you can help the team. Just don't take over ownership. Here's another huge one. New team, or maybe in a new area, or maybe some legal or regulatory things have come into play, and you understand that as a leader. And the team might not really understand what's going on there. But hey, guys, really all of these are about, I see this team approaching the cliff, right? I don't really want them to go over the cliff. Now, if they kind of skid just short of that cliff and they look over and say, oh, wow, we really dodged a bullet. Well, that's part of them learning a lesson. I can't hold their hand through everything, but I really don't want them to go off the cliff. That's no good for anybody. So these are all along that vein. I may have a bigger picture or a bigger understanding how all of the pieces fit together. So this might be a great question. Did you think through how that decision will affect this over here? So technically, an Agile team can pick any technology they want. We're going to build this new thing. Hey, I just was on the internet and I heard about this new framework that just came out. It's on GitHub. I saw it last week. It looks pretty cool. That team might decide to use that technology. And in fact, technically, no one's allowed to tell them what technology to use to solve that problem. That's part of granting power. However, the team needs to own that decision. Really simple example, worked with a client 6 or 8 years ago, and we were brought in to kind of help take over the maintenance of a product. A couple guys had built it, they left the company, and what ended up happening is they picked technologies that the company didn't know. So they had been doing for years .NET development and SQL Server, kind of the Microsoft flavor, all kinds of different projects, probably 40 or 50 projects over the years. And then there was someone that came in and they just picked all kinds of different technology. It wasn't that the technology was bad. They ended up using a document database and was all relational data, but that was a different story. But the bigger problem is that the downstream support of that product, there was a fundamental mismatch. There was an impedance mismatch between what the technology was that was used to build that product and the rest of the organization. And some teams might not be quite thinking of the big picture, but you might ask, well, does the support group know how to support this? Does our cloud team know how to manage this infrastructure? Does our DevOps group know how to support you? Do we have licensing for all these technologies? We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on licensing for all our technologies. You can pick whatever you want, but you need to own the outcome. So if choosing these technologies when you don't have to, now sometimes you got to pick a new technology because you're going to go faster, better, et cetera, and you need to make some change in the organization, but it's really important to help the team understand what's going on. So I'm just going to finish these bullets and then I'll look at the questions over here in the chat window. I can help you figure that out if you'd like. I'm offering up my services. If you say no, great, I'll go get a coffee. But I'm here for you if you need me. Hey, Jack down the hall knows about that. You may want to talk to him. So the key thing here is helping the development team, leveraging all of your expertise and all of your all of the information that you've learned over time without actually taking ownership. So let me look at the chat window here. So yeah, coaching instead of direction. Absolutely. I like to say, a manager doesn't manage. They train, mentor, coach, and provide therapy as necessary and support. So absolutely, it's coaching instead of directing. How do you make it clear to the team that the suggestion from a senior leader, even when phrased this way, is a suggestion and not a directive? Now that can be tough, right? Because if you do have a team that's used to saying, all right, I just heard something that's, a really important person in the company, we have to do what they say. I think that's a couple different things. One, the scrum master on the team, who's in charge of coaching the team with Agile principles, needs to help underscore that. Look, guys, this is probably a great idea. Sally knows a hell of a lot about what we're doing here, and she's been here forever. Don't take it as gospel, right? So just because she said, jump, don't say how high. Let's just take a look at it and make sure it's a good decision to go through that. So they can kind of underscore that ownership. The person delivering the message, they can make that more clear. Hey guys, I know that, before Agile, I'd kind of come along and tell you guys what to do. I'm not doing that anymore. I know that's against the rules. I've had my hand slapped. I'm just going to throw some stuff out at you. Don't take it as gospel. If it's the wrong idea, great. So you might want to try over communicating that a little bit, particularly if you have teams that are sort of struggling with that empowerment and or they're at that sort of beginning of their Agile journey. So you define downstream versus upstream at a high level. So I was talking about downstream here, which is everything that happens after we build the software. Upstream is we have the visionary, we have the product team that's kind of dreaming up new ideas for things for us to build. We might have an architecture team that's thinking through our sort of major moving parts as far as technology in the organization. That's, if I think about the team as a machine, the upstream stuff is everything coming into the machine. And as I'm stamping out new product, downstream is everybody who's touching that product in some form or fashion. The simplest downstream person is a user, but there's all kinds of other folks, right? The folks that need to support that product for the next X years. The folks in the customer support team who might need to troubleshoot that product. That's another perfect example. If the entire customer support team is used to using this database, if we do decide to use a different database, then that team needs to make sure that that decision is a valid one. And it might be perfect, right? Particularly these days. We typically have data that's either going to be a great fit for relational storage or a great fit for document storage. It's really important to pick the right storage for the right data. But it might be that we haven't used a document database before in our organization, and that's something new. So we're going to need to make sure that not only do we actually surface that information, but we actively work to make sure that those downstream consumers are going to understand what's going on. So I might need to go and talk to the support team. Hey guys, we're going to be using this new technology. Here's why. And I just want to give you the heads up because we're talking about releasing this in 6 months or so. I think you guys need to be ready to support it. So we're doing some training internally. We're actually bringing the vendor in to do some training. Do you guys want to have some folks, come in there? So it's total ownership. We like to talk about extreme ownership at Ascendal. It's not just thinking about, I'm writing this code. It's thinking about what's the effect of this code in terms of delivering a solution, and who are all of my customers as a team. That might not necessarily be the individual developers. That might be more the product owner thinking about those big pictures and or the scrum master. But that's what I mean by downstream and upstream. Okay, so moving along here, I just want to talk about automation. This does apply mostly to software, but this can also apply to hardware development. If you're on a marketing team, it could apply there as well. In fact, our marketing team is using a tool that scans our website and blasts out emails to us if for some reason a link gets broken or something like that. That's a perfect use of automation, right? It's keeping the level of quality high. So at the beginning, when we're working, let's just say in 2-week sprints, a sprint is a 1 week to about a calendar month. Let's just say we're working in 2-week sprints and we're happily coding along. And then we're spending some time doing some manual work. That might be, we're going to deploy some code to our test environments. We're going to actually test the entire product. And we haven't built much. We've only spent a little bit less than 2 weeks. building code. So this might be perfectly fine. But then what happens is the product starts to grow. And so now what happens is I don't quite have as much time to code because I need to spend more time on this manual work. Mostly it's related to testing. Now you really have three choices. You can manually test everything every sprint because you kind of have to know if the product still works. You could say, I'm sure we didn't break anything. If I had $1 for every time I thought I didn't break something and I did, I'd be a very rich man. Or you can actually start to apply automation. And why this is so important. Oh, did you have a question, Jerry?
No, sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. So why this is so important is we get to a tipping point where if we were to leverage solely manual means, we can't actually get it all done. And this is really where we reach that inflection point. You have no choice. You have to either say, we're not going to test the whole product each sprint, which is a very slippery slope, or we're going to do a little bit of code and then we're going to have a testing sprint, right? And now all of a sudden we're doing Scrum Butt, just like Di said. Having a production sprint and a testing sprint, that doesn't count. Doing a little bit of everything all the time is what we're doing with Scrum. So yeah, someone just said not testing the whole product is really a trap. So what we want to do is we want to leverage automation, and this is super critical. So regardless of what product you're building in software, we've got a few different ways to leverage automation. We can use automated unit testing. We can use automated integration testing. We can do other sorts of automation. We can do static code analysis. There's all kinds of tools that we need to do that we can take advantage of. And it's super critical because if you don't apply the automation, you're going to end up here and potentially end up on that slippery slope. So just to recap here, our keys to success. Discipline. It's just a few things you have to do, but you have to do them all the time. What I love about Agile and Scrum in particular is it's super simple, but people fall into the trap of thinking, well, you know what? It's these things, I can do a few less. As I like to tell people, look, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of man hours, millions of man hours have been spent experimenting with this framework. All the stuff that doesn't need to be there is gone. It's all gone. You don't need to take anything else out. And in fact, if you take anything else out, you're probably going to get into trouble because it's already the smallest, simplest thing that could possibly work. One of my favorite sayings with Agile. So you got to do all those things all the time, consistently, and that's how you're going to get the results. Second one is empowerment. Particularly those leaders that know everything and been around forever. They're not put out to pasture when Agile comes along. Their intelligence and experience and knowledge and wisdom is leveraged, but now they need to be a helper as opposed to a doer or a director. And then finally, leveraging automation, which is really the critical point to be able to do this. Because if you can't produce a potentially shippable product increment within that 2 weeks, what happens is that you might say, well, maybe we should do 3 weeks, or maybe we should do a month. And that's fine, but that starts to sort of impose a lot of restrictions on the organization. Why? Because you're not allowed to change direction during a sprint. So if business conditions change during that month, the business is either going to be a little bit tied in terms of their hands, or you're going to start cheating. You're going to start saying, well, I know the sprint's not over, but we're going to just change some stuff out. We're going to change some scope. So 2 weeks is a really good sweet spot. It's enough time for a team to get a good head of steam and some good momentum, but it's a short enough time that if business conditions change, then the business can pivot by giving some different direction and different priorities to that team. If you can't actually drive the product to a potentially shippable state, you're really doing your company a disservice. So is testing, when there's a lot of product already developed, very similar to regression testing? Yeah, regression testing at its simplest is really saying, testing everything that we didn't work on or touch this sprint. It's everything for the previous 1 to 200 sprints. So regression testing is basically making sure that you're testing everything all the time. Luckily, with today's contemporary automated unit testing and automated integration testing, it's really easy to test 100% of the critical functionality all the time. In fact, typically multiple times per day. Our teams, every time they commit a code change multiple times per day, the continuous integration server gets the code, compiles it, and executes hundreds, if not thousands, of unit tests, which exercise every aspect of the application, and then spits out a big warning message to the development team if they broke anything. I have heard of people that didn't do that, me included, in the early days. And what would happen is we'd touch stuff and then we'd ship the product. We would test the heck out of it for weeks and weeks and weeks. We'd ship it, and guaranteed within like a day, some customer would find something broken that had been working for 6 months and working for 4 previous releases. And they're kind of looking at us thinking, did you guys test this? Because I found this in 5 minutes. Well, that wasn't one of our manual tests. This was pre-automated unit testing. Today, we ship products today out of every sprint that are dramatically more solid than we would ship after 6 months of being out in the field. It's really amazing what we have today. Let's see, do we still want to do integration testing if applicable and functional testing of the new functionality being put out in addition to the regression testing? So I can tell you how we do it. So we look at it as sort of a pyramid. Our foundation is automated unit testing. We cover 100% of the functionality and logic of our applications. That's not 100% of the code. There's some code that doesn't really have any logic to it, and we just ignore that. But anything that has an if or a switch or a calculation or something where it's going to have some workflow into other areas of the application, that by our standard has to be 100% covered by unit tests. When I say covered, I mean is exercised by that test automation every time, several times a day that a code change is checked in. The other thing that we do is we manually test new features in each sprint. So part of the team making sure things work is they're going to manually test that feature. And then the product owner is going to also manually test that feature, probably not quite as thoroughly. And then we automate a subset of those manual tests as integration tests. We don't automate every single function point in the system because that's extraordinarily expensive, both in terms of the initial effort and the upkeep and the maintenance to keep all that stuff running. So that's why I think about our testing strategy or our quality strategy as a pyramid. 100% of the functionality from unit tests, a smaller percentage based on the manual tests when we're just making sure it's coming together right, and then an even smaller percentage with our automated integration testing. That's more testing sort of critical flows. If we were building the next Amazon, that would be, I'm going to go create an account. I'm going to add some products to my cart. I'm going to check out. I'm going to put in a testing credit card number. I'm going to make sure that the order went through. I'm going to make sure I get a confirmation email. And I'm going to make sure that the order got into our order backend system correctly. That would be an automated integration test. All kinds of other stuff happening in there, we would rely heavily on our unit tests to cover that. All right, let's lengthen our sprints argument as hiding some other impediment like not breaking down stories small enough. Yep, very good point. If you can't quite get your stories done in a sprint, it's usually that they're too large and or you're not quite, actually, that's usually the too large. If you have stories that keep coming back into sprints because, uh-oh, that wasn't actually done, or there's a whole bunch of bugs, that usually points to the discipline part. It might be the process discipline. It might also be the technical discipline. It's not quite there. All right, so I do have a few sections here that you guys can read in my book that tie into what we talked about today. A couple other things I mentioned. I mentioned the walking skeleton. I talk a little bit about that in the book as well. And with that, I'm going to segue back over to Di, and we have an opportunity for you guys to get a signed copy of my book.
Yes, we will send a free copy of Dave's book to the first 5 people that text Epic Bonus to 33777. And
This is
everyone,
ask you to plug in your email address once you text, so we can get it over to you.
yeah, everyone who texts will receive bonus content from the Epic Guide to Agile and a summary of the presentation. And we have made the slides available to Agile New England, and those will be sent out to you along with the recording, I believe, or made available to you on the website along with the recording. And that's it for us. So I think we still have plenty of time for more questions and answers. If people want to, at this point, unmute yourselves so you don't have to type. You can just shout out your questions if you want.
I think Sherry, I don't know if Sherry, you raised your hand recently, but if you have a question, go ahead and unmute and lay it on us. Oh, maybe she's good to go. Any other questions? And I'm sorry, Nancy, can you remind us what time do you need to shift back to the other part of your program, just to make sure we're in your time box?
Oh, you're doing fine. You can take a few more questions if you like.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, feel free to go ahead and unmute and shout them out, or you can put them in the chat window and we can look there and answer them. And if we don't see any questions in the next 30 seconds, we'll shift gears here.
Dave, I was thinking on that last comment about lengthening the sprints, sometimes there is a DevOps issue, right? We've run into that quite a bit where all of the testing couldn't happen in the 2-week time span. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that can be a challenge as well. So I think, that's really another reason why, I mentioned at the beginning, you want to drive those sort of infrastructure pieces to done as quickly as you can at the beginning. Ideally, in the couple of weeks leading up to your first sprint where you're actually working on user stories and new functionality. Sometimes it doesn't get, quite driven to done. And that's where you really want to drive hard on that first sprint. You might reduce the amount of functionality you're working on so that you can have enough bandwidth to drive those DevOps pieces to done. And again, when we say DevOps, there's really 2 critical pieces. One is continuous integration. Again, that's the piece that's grabbing the code upon every check-in, compiling it, and executing all the unit tests, and either giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. By the way, if it's a thumbs down, the rule is the development teams drops everything until that bug is fixed. They don't do anything else until that's addressed. The other piece of DevOps is continuous deployment. That's having the test environments and then having automation that gets the code into those test environments. Let's see. So Sherry wrote me a note. She's still here. Oh, she just posted that in the chat window. Yeah, so our email is right here on the screen. Feel free to follow up. By the way, we're open to questions beyond this presentation. Feel free to reach out. We'd be more than happy to lend any and all hints and tips and tricks from over the years.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Nice send off.
I did think of one more thing that was related to discipline, and it could be related to DevOps, but having the discipline to not bring a story into the sprint that you can't complete because you may have a dependency on another team or a dependency on DevOps to get your environment spun up. So that's another area where we find, sometimes the product owner or the team really just want to work on a specific feature, but there's no way that it could get completed in the 2-week sprint because of those dependencies. So, some of our teams had so many dependencies because they were very dependent and working closely with other teams that they had a definition of ready, and their user story needed to meet the definition of ready before it could get brought into the sprint. So that was a really great innovation that they came up with to help them determine if they were setting themselves up for success. Thanks again for having us. You guys were great. A lot of great questions.